Hey, it's Benji Cole, son of Al Cole from CBS Radio and host of People of Distinction, the talk that gives an in-depth view of some of the most dynamic, intelligent, and successful people on the planet. Run to our website, peopleofdistinction.org for more info, or you can always email me directly at benji@alcoleenterprises.com. And on the line with us today, we have Daryl B. Sutter. We'll be discussing his fantastic book, The Day I Reached My Tipping Point, Compassion, Fatigue, and Educators. Available for purchase through Amazon.com. And I will say, Daryl was brought to our network, People of Distinction, today by some of the best movers in the business. Author Reputation Press Publishing. So if you have a book that you'd like moved, do yourself a favor and contact our great friends over there at ARP. And you can find out more information on them at authorreputationpress.com. Listen, it is an absolute pleasure to have Daryl here on the line. The moment you go to his Amazon page and you start to do any research on the book, you understand exactly what we're going to be discussing today. Now, you guys know I've mentioned this a number of times on previous interviews. I've had a very brief stint in education myself. I taught college for 3 years, and I taught fourth graders for 1, and I absolutely loved it. It was amazing and a very, very great time in my life. And, of course, my significant other now is a high school teacher, and she's been teaching for the past 15 years. And the one thing that we constantly discuss is how difficult the education system is. As an educator, as much as you would like to believe that educators only wear one hat, and that they are just a history teacher or just a math teacher, science teacher, so on and so forth. That is not the case, right? Anybody that is either in education or knows someone in it understands that they have to wear multiple hats. Some days you're an educator. Other days you're a friend. Other days you're a therapist. I mean, it just goes on and on. Now, we put so much on educators, and we believe that they can handle it. And a lot of times they can for the most part. But at a certain point, like everybody else, they're going to reach their tipping point. And especially given the past 2 years with this pandemic that we've all experienced, education and the educators have been put under the microscope and have been really overwhelmed. And again, speaking from personal experience, it is not the greatest situation right now, and I'm so glad that we have Daryl here on the line because it's a self-help guide created to assist teachers on their journey in the classroom. But get this, even though in the title it's focused on educators, and even though Daryl with his background maybe started with that impression, guys, this is something that can be used in so many other professions because we know that the passion you bring to it can only take you so far. And listen, Daryl is the expert. Okay, he's written the book. He's done the research. He's going to be able to articulate everything much better than I ever could. So without further ado, let's jump right in. Daryl, first and foremost, welcome to People of Distinction, and thank you so much for being a guest. How are you?
I'm doing very well, Benji. Thank you for receiving me this afternoon.
Absolutely. Well, listen, we're very much looking forward to it. Selfishly, for myself, I am looking to steal some words of wisdom from you to take back to my significant other because I know, again, she has really been overwhelmed these past couple of years, and the education system is tough enough already. But with this lockdown, with the variations of, distance learning that we've all been experiencing and going through, your book is so incredibly timely. So we're really looking forward to the words of wisdom we're going to be able to receive from you, Daryl. Now, before we go into the book, let's hold off slightly. Start by telling our listening audience a little bit more about yourself and your background, please.
Sure. I would love to do that, Benji. My background consists of a little bit of sales when I got out of university the first time. And then I was convinced to get into the field of education. I became an educator and was successful for 30 plus years in the field of education. I'm now retired. Prior to retiring, I knew I didn't want to just sit around and idle away my retirement years. So I took courses to become a counselor, and I was able to identify in the courses flags that I had experienced throughout my 30 years of teaching, and those flags are listed in the book, and they have specific names to them. We know them as burnout, which is the most common one, but then we also have occupational stress injury, compassion fatigue, and empathy erosion. When I went through my course to become a counselor, and I'm a provincially registered psychologist now, I began researching for my major assignment at the end of the course to complete the master's degree. And I discovered that there was very few or little information regarding education, educators, and burnout. So I identified a need in this area to bring awareness of how socially, emotionally, physically, and psychologically the professional in educator is and can be affected by stress, anxiety, depression. Once I wrote the report, I then decided that it was time to take it to the next step and get it published.
Daryl, thank you so much for sharing. Now, I know we've already started to go into the book, but let's go a little bit more in depth. Talk to us now about the book and how it's constructed and laid out, please.
Thank you, Benji. It is not your typical book. It is designed for self-help, as you mentioned in the intro. It's also laid out according to the chapters of the format that the program required of me. So at the beginning, I'm just flipping it open here. At the beginning, it ends up having 8 chapters. Chapter 1, compassion, fatigue, and educators. Then we get into the history of the topic, the effects of the topic, my personal experience, and how then, once I had reached my tipping point, then refilling my cup of empathy so that I could get back into a helping profession. Finally, it ends up with a conclusion of how change is inevitable, yes, but on the same token, if we have some control over our professional lives and some significant input into our professional lives and direction, it can reduce that degree of stress and anxiety from pressures coming from above being administrators, head offices, government, bureaucrats, and government legislation.
Mm-hmm. You know, Daryl, next area that I wanted to go to that I'm really curious about. So there's 2 terms, which you've already mentioned briefly in previous answers, that you really discuss in the book. So the first one is CF, compassion fatigue, and then the other one is OSI, occupational stress injury. First and foremost, ground level floor, what are those terms? What do they mean? And how can they impact an educator?
I'm glad you mentioned that, Benji. Excuse me. The reality is they all relate to the same thing. There's just throughout the course of history, there have been different acknowledgments of people suffering from burnout, whether it's in biblical stories right through to modern day stories. The reality is that it has been around forever. It's also not a global entity, but over the course of time, it has been labeled differently. The most common term is burnout. However, depending on the profession, it becomes occupational stress injury. Depending on the profession, it can be compassion fatigue. Empathy erosion is also just another term which typically refers to burnout, the lack of the ability to handle external stressors that are impacting your ability to work professionally. For example, in the healthcare industry. It's called compassion fatigue. I used it for my educational aspect of it because we have in classrooms now, we have such a diverse needs within the classroom, usually with and majority without proper support in place. The teacher who wants to do his best or her best possible job of educating those students and are compassionate when they see these kids come to school with their own stressors and own anxiety, which are causing them to be in stress. When they walk through that door and you see it in their face and in their body language, your heart goes out to them. I'm supposed to be able to teach these kids that they're coming with things that are happening in their family lives, in their communities, in their family dynamics. They may not have had breakfast. They may not have had a good night's sleep. There might have been tension in the household, and they're expected to learn a curriculum. My compassion comes up first and foremost. I want, as a teacher, when I was a teacher, my desire was to make sure they are A, safe, B, comfortable and warm, and third, know they're wanted in the classroom. That there's somebody there who's going to show them compassion, be empathetic with them, and also that it's a safe place to be and to learn.
Mm-hmm. Guys, again, here in the line with Daryl B. Sutter. We're discussing his fantastic book, The Day I Reached My Tipping Point, Compassion Fatigue in Educators, available for purchase through Amazon.com. Daryl, everything that you're saying is fascinating. And again, I know that this can apply to other professions, not solely educators, but that's the main focus right now that we're focusing on. Now, this book was released in 2019. We know the past 2 years with this pandemic, things have gotten compounded to the nth degree. Now, I believe it would be safe to assume you're talking about this compassion fatigue and this OSI and all these different pressures. Maybe it's too early, and I'm not sure if enough research has been conducted yet, but how have these things now become magnified through this pandemic and through distance learning?
It's a very good question, Benji. And I'll have to collect my thoughts here for just a second. Distant education, what you're referring to as virtual learning, kids sitting in front of a video screen, supposedly engaged with the teacher who is trying to teach their lesson, is a disconnect. Education is not about technology. It's about the human connection. It's about being in the room, same room with the kid, so you can answer immediately questions. Yes, I'm well aware of technology and the benefits it brings to the classroom, but it does not replace the human interaction that 95% of a classroom needs for learning. The reality is the pandemic has compounded the workload for educators to provide now virtual lessons. And what we find happening is the students who want to learn will engage, will do the assignments. Those who were semi-engaged may engage with a classroom or with the virtual learning experience. But let's be honest, if it's not a requirement, if it's not something that is front and center, who's going to pick up the tablet? Who's going to pick up the lesson? Who's going to put any effort into it? So we have kids who have, students who have lost in Alberta here. Actually, it's just been announced this past couple months, huge amounts of money directed toward the kindergarten to grade 3 curriculum to catch the kids who have fallen through the cracks of all the virtual learning that took place in kindergarten to grade 3, because that's not how the kids learned. They needed to be in front and with their peers to learn. So to answer your question, Benji, the pandemic is and still is compounding the workload for educators, and is also causing frustration for educators as well, because of the need to interact with their children outside of school hours now, as opposed to within the classroom. And there's really no break between what the technology offers and when a teacher, an educator, needs to recharge or refill their cup of empathy.
Oh, man, it's a vicious cycle, and not to just make it all negative. Daryl, I know.
No.
I
don't want to make it negative.
Of course, it's a difficult situation, right? I mean, again, it's a vicious cycle where I think the first point you need to do is actually acknowledge the problem, right? Acknowledge that there is something there that needs to be addressed, that needs to be fixed. And I think that is why your book is so important. Not only are you addressing the problem, but you're also providing tips and measures to help overcome, or at least break down some of those barriers. Now, follow-up question that I want to lead into as we start to close out this fantastic interview, Daryl. Guys, you know what you have to do. Amazon.com is the only place that you can go to gather all of the tips, all of the valuable pieces of information that Daryl has supplied. But since we have you here on the line, I'd be doing my listening audience a disservice if I didn't ask this next question. Since we have you here, any tips that you discuss in the book, maybe one or two of them, that you can relay to our listening audience, any educators that are out there feeling the pressure from the system that has been constructed, or, as we've stated on a number of occasions, these tips can also be applied and implemented in other professions. So any tips that you can offer and relay to our listening audience to just give them a little bit more of a teaser, Daryl.
Yes, thank you. I will do that, Benji. And yes, the tips are the main focus of helping people to refill their cup of empathy and to reestablish themselves as a true professional. There's air quotes around that, by the way, but because because the labels are so broad, there are two self-assessment. There's two self-assessment suggestions or recommendations in the books, specifically for just the general population, so that they can determine their level of burnout, and it's referred to as the Maslow Burnout Inventory. It was developed by Maslow when he identified the need for it. It was so successful that what ended up happening was he developed the Maslow Burnout Inventory for teachers, specifically designed for teachers. And so Maslow is the go-to tip that I would acknowledge or send people to check yourself, to do a self-assessment and see if you are falling into the trap of anxiety, stress, and then burnout. There is a second one put forward by a gentleman by the name of Glowski, spelled Glogowski, Teacher Burnout and Stress and Mindful Meditation Survey. Another very good indicator of where a person, specifically a teacher in this case, is in that range of potential burnout, to get a bird's eye view of where the educator is at, because it does fluctuate. You have good days, you have bad days. Mm-hmm. But overall, these two assessment tools take a snapshot of where you are at the present time. If you find that you score high on the inventories, then the next suggestion is to seek help from a trained professional, that you are experiencing burnout. These indicators are flags that your social life, your emotional life, your physical well-being, and psychologically you're being affected, whether you realize it or not. So that would be two major tips coming out of the book. The reality is, I'm speaking from experience, Benji. I reached my tipping point. I did not realize that my social, emotional, physical well-being and my family dynamics were being compromised until an uncharacteristic personal response of myself towards a professional situation sent me over the edge, literally. Mm-hmm. And it was an interesting road back to reality, on realizing that I had eventually started down the path, or had become enmeshed, I guess is a better way to put it, with PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. The reality is there's two types of PTSD. There's instantaneous, where something traumatic happens immediately, like a car crash, house fire, those, and not to make light of it or make light of first responders or anything, but they have to deal with, or the military. They are obviously under a lot of stress. They do suffer PTSD, but for educators, specifically myself, I recognized in the research and in myself that the second type of trauma, which PTSD is associated with, is a slow-moving series of events towards the tipping point. And throughout my teaching career of 30 years, I went through the novice stage, which is mentioned in the book, the sophomore stage, which is mentioned in the book, and finally ended up in the senior stage. It was in the senior stage when I finally realized that over the course of those 30 years, little bits and pieces of my compassion and my empathy were being eroded from my desire to be a professional educator. Those slow-moving series of events eventually accumulated in that response of mine, which was completely uncharacteristic for myself, for people who know me, and it was a huge wake-up call. So Absolutely. If I had had these tools, the Naslock Burnout Inventory for Teachers, or the Goloski Teacher Burnout, to check that throughout my course of my career, if I had even known about them, Benji, before I'd reached that tipping point, I think I could have saved myself. I really do, if I'd been aware of it, but I wasn't.
You know, Daryl, I'm really curious. The cover to your book, it has an image of a coffee cup on there. Now, it's a great image, because the coffee cup, of course, is shattered into pieces. Now, I think I can assume the connection that you're trying to make here, but go ahead and talk to our listening audience about that book cover and why you chose that photo to be the representation for your book.
Thank you, Benji. I appreciate that, because it is true that I used to drink a lot of coffee and tea, and I've never met an educator who hasn't had a coffee cup or a tea cup in their hand, running to class to cry and get ready after their 15-minute coffee break, or whatever the case, recess break. The reality is, as I mentioned earlier in the interview, I did reach a tipping point. All my values and beliefs and principles in my life were scattered. all over the place. I was not the man or the teacher I wanted to be. The picture of the coffee cup represents to me a teacher's vessel of empathy. Even scattered, there is a bit of the old passion left in the cup. And by repairing the cup through therapy and professional assistance, I was able to pick up the pieces and attach the scattered pieces of myself back together. Once repaired, I was able to then slowly begin to refill the passion and the empathy that brought me to teaching in the first place. I became more aware, and a tipping point, can happen and take steps. I'm now more aware that the tipping point can happen at any time, and I take steps to be aware of my own stress, anxiety, and how it builds up, and I take constructive, positive steps to combat the anxiety and the stress that comes with being an educator and just being a human being.
You know what I love so much about all of this is we're at the end of the interview now, and we've covered so much information, yet we've barely scratched the surface. There's still so much left to be discovered, and that's why Amazon.com is the place you have to go. The Day I Reached My Tipping Point, Compassion, Fatigue, and Educators is the title you have to pick up, and Daryl B. Sutter is the author you have to thank for bringing it to your table. Let's grow, let's develop, let's educate ourselves, and it starts with this fantastic narrative. Daryl, this has been truly a pleasure. What an honor. Thank you very much for all of the words of wisdom you've been able to relay, and thank you for being a guest on People of Distinction.
My pleasure. My pleasure.